for every action, a consequence. The concept itself is incredibly simple. No matter what you do in life, whether intentional or not, something, somewhere, somehow will be influenced by it, for better or for worse. On the surface, it seems very straightforward, but even with an understanding of it, it's almost impossible to predict just how your actions will change the people or world around you, or even how you'll change yourself. Consequences are what keep us aware of our behavior, and everything you do has a consequence. However, most consequences are small in scale or harmless in some way. Plenty can even be perceived as good consequences. We have a strange disconnect with the word, and we only associate it with negative events, because those are the only times when we think to examine what led us to that point. Look back on all the good things that have happened to you in life. All of your highest highs are direct consequences of events that came before them. Your life in its entirety can be distilled down into actions and consequences. I'm a big fan of media properties that take the time to show this idea at work over the course of the narrative. And while plenty of shows come to mind that meet this criteria, there's one in particular that I've been meaning to talk about lately, and that's the anime Hunter x Hunter. It's not my favorite anime by any means, but it certainly has its merits. So if you are even mildly interested in the show, please go watch that first, as there will be big story spoilers in this video. Hunter x Hunter follows the adventures of a kid named Gon, your typical anime protagonist that wants to see the good in everyone and has a very magnetic kind of charisma to him that draws people to be his allies or support him in some way. Now, Gon has a goal, to find his dad, who is a well-respected hunter. In order to do so though, Gon has to become a hunter himself. It sets the stage for obstacles that Gon has to overcome, which is all most people will care about. As Gon goes on his adventures and discovers the immense gap in power between other established hunters and himself, that becomes the foundation of his personality. After a while, I kinda noticed something that rubbed me the wrong way. Gon doesn't really go through a character arc until the story arc we'll be discussing momentarily, and that arc is near the end of the current run of the anime. Gon goes through challenges and trials, but they don't particularly change him in a tangible way. He remains the optimist, the beacon of light, and retains his childlike innocence through just about all of his struggles. In a way, his lack of change becomes part of the arc for another character, specifically Killua. Gon became less interesting than the people like Killua or Kurapika because of his lack of a discernible character arc. I became more invested in Kurapika's vengeance-driven quest to recover the eyes of his clan, and Killua's internal struggle between the light Gon had instilled in him and the darkness his family had forced him to acclimate to. But Gon himself didn't interest me much as a character until the tail end of the Chimera Ant arc. Leading up to this arc, Gon learns to manipulate Nen. Think of Nen as something similar to chakra for Naruto. Control of one's own Nen is what made the gap between Gon and other hunters so wide. As mentioned before, Gon was on a mission to get stronger, and mastering his Nen was pivotal in that pursuit. Both he and Killua grew considerably stronger in the episodes leading up to the Chimera Ant arc, which is where Gon begins a beautiful arc that ties back to the very beginning of the story. So I watched the 1999 version of the show, OVAs included, and then jumped ahead to the modern iteration, picking up where the 99 version left off. In the 1999 version, we meet a character named Kite right at the beginning of the story. He saves Gon from a wild animal and ultimately sets him on the path to being a pro hunter. In the short amount of time they spend together, they form a bond and Gon truly respects Kite. In the 1999 version, we get to see that rapport form between them. After the Great Island arc, Gon once again crosses paths with Kite, who he introduces Killua to. The two decide to shadow Kite and train under him, with their first endeavor being to investigate reports of an oversized insect, later understood to be that of a Chimera Ant. Gon is clearly beyond excited to once again be in the company of someone who he holds in such high regard, and with Kite around, Gon has more confidence than ever. Their investigation takes them deep into a neighboring country, and things take a terrible turn. Before we get into the meat of this, let me briefly explain what the Chimera Ants are. They're creatures that reproduce through phagogenesis, which in this anime means that the queen ant eats other organisms and passes traits from that organism onto her offspring. The queen seeks to consume strong organisms in order to pass along the best possible traits to what will eventually become the king of the next generation. Humans end up on the feeding list, and the queen eventually consumes a human with significant Nen, which leads to the birthing of significantly more powerful Chimera Ants, along with a trio that stands head and shoulders above the rest and answer only to the king, the Royal Guard. Anyway, Kite and the boys come to a stop where he can sense an immense danger approaching. He warns the boys to run, and that split second was all it took for the enemy, Neferpitou, to show herself and sever one of Kite's arms. Gon psychs himself up to attack, but Killua incapacitates him and carries him away, understanding that not only would they stand no chance, they'd actively be a hindrance to Kite, and so they leave him behind to fight alone. We soon discover that Pitou has not only killed Kite, but she has put him back together to act as a sort of training dummy for the Chimera forces. This gives the enemy troops the skill training they need to effectively defend themselves and continue harvesting humans for the Queen's consumption. Kite is eventually recovered by the hunters, but it is believed that he's under the influence of Pitou's Nen ability, and that it would take direct intervention from her to release his mind. When Gon is faced with this, we see, for the first time, a true absence of his bright personality. The tangible, deeply rooted anger and the despair that comes with it is uncomfortable and jarring, to say the very least. Gon blames himself for Kite's condition, realizing that he still lacked the strength necessary to protect the people he cared about, as well as realizing that Kite likely wouldn't have fallen victim to Pitou if he hadn't had to worry about Gon and Killua. The threads of Gon's own actions begin the weaving of consequences for not just him, but the people in his direct orbit. If we double back to the beginning of Gon's story when he met Kite, his decision all that time ago to pursue a career as a hunter doomed Kite to his fate. Every action Gon took through his journey brought Kite one step closer to death until the last dominoes finally toppled. Many consequences stem outward like a web from Kite's death, beginning most notably with Gon and his slow descent into absolute rage. Even Killua can see the light inside Gon dimming, and it's made clear at several intervals in the story that Killua seeks to prevent Gon from losing that light. It's part of what draws him to Gon in the first place, so watching anger twist and pervert all of Gon's actions leading up to his final confrontation with Pitou weighs heavily on Killua. Killua consistently sees himself as nothing more than a killer, the assassin his family raised him to be, but Gon is always there to save him from that dark line of thought. Yet, when Killua sees Gon going down the same road, he essentially finds himself feeling helpless in the face of Gon's blind ambition. Gon can't see how far he's falling into his own guilt, so Killua's concern just doesn't reach him. We get a reminder that Gon is still just a child when he throws a tantrum in the face of his enemy, who refuses to fight until she's healed a human girl that was injured during the assault on the Chimera Ant Palace. Gon can't reconcile the loss of his role model with the idea that the same person who killed him is actively trying to protect someone else, a human no less. Pitou, just like Kite, was brought one step closer to death with every action Gon took. Just the small instance of Gon simply being present when she attacked Kite was enough to set off a chain of events that would end in her defeat. In a sense, she was dead the moment Kite met Gon. She was dead long before she was even born, all because a young boy was inspired to action by a pro hunter that happened to cross paths with him. Things get worse once Gon takes Pitou back to where Kite is being kept. She decides to tell Gon the truth. Kite has been dead for quite some time and there's nothing that can be done to help him. She prepares to kill Gon, thinking that her admission would rob him of his morale. Instead, her action has a very real and dangerous consequence. Gon gives in to the negative emotions inside of him and transforms into an adult version of himself. In order to do so though, he had to give up something, and it's heavily implied that he gave up the remainder of his life energy to make the transformation possible. To defeat the creature that took the life of his role model, he'd have to give up his own, an action, and a consequence. The consequences for Pitou continue and she's brutalized by Gon. Killua arrives to see Gon is transformed and instantly recognizes the severity of the situation. Remember, Killua has been quietly working to preserve the light in Gon's spirit, a direct consequence of the good influence Gon has had on the child. So not only has Gon relinquished his life force, Killua is also in a position where he feels as though he's losing the one truly good thing in his life. Gon, in his blind desire to destroy Pitou, effectively forced his best friend to pay for his actions. This is the point where most anime would find a way to keep the protagonist from suffering any direct consequences by immediately exploiting a loophole or something. But Hunter x Hunter takes Gon's actions and forces the people he cares about to shoulder the consequences. After the arc comes to a close, Gon is in critical condition and is essentially removed from the anime, leaving his friends to find a way to help him. The reality of Gon's imminent demise as his body slowly withers away leaves Killua and Leorio scrambling for something, anything, to help their friend survive. Killua is left no course of action but to confront his family in a bid to receive help from his younger sibling, who could theoretically heal Gon. This leads Killua to reconcile with and free his younger sibling from captivity, and show us why he's one of the best anime brothers out there. And it nearly leads Leorio to becoming the next chairman of the Hunter Association. His concern for Gon's life damn near uniting the other hunters in the desire to save the rising star. Hell, it even finally leads Gon to an eventual, but brief, reunion with his father. None of these things would have been possible if Kite had not crossed paths with Gon. That one encounter set everything in motion, but it's framed as a borderline throwaway segment designed to just get Gon into the hunting life. Gon going into the forest and almost getting mauled by a large animal led straight to the death of Kite, his own close call with death, the reconnection of Killua with his younger sister, and more. And while his chance encounter started the journey, Neferpito's simple desire to test her own strength on a randomly selected target was the true crux of Gon's most interesting emotional arc. All it would take to change the entirety of the story would be for Pitou to attack someone else, and just like that, her actions would have immeasurably different consequences, for better or for worse. And I know you can make that argument and examine any story to find these kinds of threads of actions to consequence, but it isn't often that you're made to consider just how far back the actions start, or how far-reaching the consequences can be when they manifest. Plenty of shows have actions, but there are basically no consequences, or the consequences are explained away or circumvented. My buddy Kevin the Giraffe exposed me to a perfect example of this without realizing it. So, I don't watch Grey's Anatomy, but I was asked to watch a very specific scene. Dr. Chick here pulls what appears to be an artillery shell out of a dude, hands it off to a bomb guy who walks away with it and promptly explodes. If you were a good writer, you'd find a way to tie something as significant as an explosion into subsequent episodes, right? Guess what? They don't. It's just never mentioned. An explosion in a hospital is just never talked about. That explosion doesn't set off a chain of events that can be traced back to it. It just happens for the sake of shock value, and then the script moves on. Hunter x Hunter uses a moment late in its run to bring these concepts together and make you tug on threads that influenced other events. It makes you wonder just how many of Gon's deceptively small actions have had direct or indirect consequences in other arcs and for other people. It goes a long way in making the world feel lived in while still focusing on one person's choices and ideals. For every action, there's a consequence. And it's often difficult to recognize what the potential consequences are until the time comes for the universe to collect its debt. Interestingly, while Gon's humanity is the focal point of his character, Kite's death is what leads him to trading it away. And as one character relinquishes his humanity at what he perceived was the end of his life, another character gains humanity at the end of his. But that's a discussion for next week, so make sure you tune in. And as always, thanks for watching.